Welcome back to Beating Sisyphus, a production of the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets in collaboration with the Cornell Emerging Markets Institute Club, live from Ithaca, New York. We bring together leaders from across economics, technology, and policy to explore how innovation merges under pressure. My name is Thomas Riveros, and I co-host this alongside Lourdes Casanova, the director of the center. Today, we are very glad to welcome on the show Eswar Prasad. Eswar is the Tolani Senior Professor of International Trade Policy at Cornell and a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and later led the IMF's China division. Today, we are here to discuss his latest book, Doom Loop, in which he argues that the forces we thought would bring together greater stability, such as globalization, international organizations, and the rise of middle powers, have actually created a destructive feedback loop. Eswar, it's an incredible honor to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Thomas and Lourdes, for having me on. It's a real pleasure to talk to both of you.
Thank you, Eswar. And also for me, it's very special because you are a colleague that I admire. Seeing you at the IMF 2 weeks ago in the global economics forecast, it was really amazing. And so I respect you. I follow what you say, and definitely I learn a lot from you. So let's start by looking back at your career. So how did you become interested in economics?
So first of all, Lourdes, let me say that the respect and admiration is mutual. I know that you've accomplished a great deal here at Cornell, especially with the Emerging Markets Institute, which has gone from strength to strength. I remember the very modest beginnings, and it's hard to imagine that it was so modest given how far you have brought it. And I know that it's your dynamism, your leadership that has really elevated the Emerging Markets Institute to such prominence. As for my journey to economics, Lourdes, the truth is it was a bit of a sort of strange path, because in India, the bright students typically go into engineering or medicine. The leftovers go into accounting. And I didn't find any of these particularly appealing. And I thought economics was quite interesting, and had anticipated getting a degree in economics and then an MBA and then going off to get a career. But as I started in my undergraduate work in economics at the University of Madras, I found that I was quite drawn to it, and especially the sense that it provided a framework to think about a broad range of issues got me more interested in economics. So maybe out of sheer inertia, I just continued with economics, applied to graduate school in the United States, was admitted to a few places, came here, and ever since I've relished studying economics. So it's been a real joy and a privilege to be in this field, which I think provides a very powerful set of tools for thinking about really a very broad range of issues, not just in economics and finance.
So thank you. I remember when I arrived in Cornell in 2012, where soon after you published the book about the strength of the dollar, that was a completely different world than today. So what have you brought to this more pessimistic view right now in your book, Doom Loop? So what happened that changed completely the way you face and you study and you think that things are going to go?
So one thing worth noting is that the 2014 book of mine that you referred to, The Dollar Trap, the main thesis of that book was that the dollar's prominence is not just a result of US economic strength, financial markets, institutions, and so on, but also the result of weaknesses in the rest of the world. And we can come back to talking more about this later. But the thesis of that book, if anything, has gotten validated over time. But in the Doom Loop, I wanted to think about a broader set of issues about where the world economic and financial order is headed. And to be honest, I had a very different book in mind when I got started on this project. I had anticipated writing a book about how, in the 1990s, with the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States became the dominant power in every respect, military, economic, financial. And now, of course, economic power is much more evenly distributed with the emerging markets that you know so very well, Lourdes, and that you too have studied, Thomas, such as China, India, and many others have become much more important in terms of their GDP. And as an economist, one instinctively thinks that more competition is good for efficiency, for balance, and also for stability. Because when no power is dominant, it means that no power can be reckless with its policies because there will be significant consequences in terms of loss of power. So I was going to write a book about all the forces that would take us back towards this more stable world, a more stable equilibrium, as we economists might call it. But as I started thinking about the forces that might generate this shift back towards this new equilibrium, I quickly came to the conclusion, actually not quickly, it took me a while to come to this conclusion, that in fact we are stuck in a very difficult moment when the forces of economics, domestic politics, and geopolitics are stuck in a negative feedback loop. That is, they are bringing out the worst in each other. I'll just give you one example, which is that of globalization, something that, again, you have written extensively about and worked on, Lourdes. Once upon a time, not too long ago, it was seen as a positive sum game, one where different countries could benefit mutually through increased trade and financial flows. And the one very important element of that was that not only did it generate positive benefits for all countries involved, but also it provided an offset to the intrinsically zero-sum game of geopolitics. And in geopolitics, one country gains influence, the other country almost by definition has to lose influence. Economics doesn't have to be like that. Trade can benefit everybody. But now, even globalization has come to be seen as a zero-sum game where one country's gains in trade can come only at the expense of another. And this has affected domestic politics in a very negative way. There is a sense that globalization might have had benefits at the aggregate level, even in countries like the United States, but many people have not shared in those benefits. They feel left out in terms of job opportunities and in terms of economic opportunities more broadly. So they tend to vote against politicians who are seen as in favor of globalization. So now you have this negative link between economics and politics, and that affects geopolitical relationships as well. And the downward spiraling of the US-China relationship is a perfect example of that. So now we have these three forces that could have been working in a positive direction, and indeed were working in a positive direction in the 1990s and 2000s, now working in the form of a doom loop.
No, that's fascinating. And I think we'll definitely turn to globalization a bit later on. I wanted to start, though, speaking a bit on the importance of dollar dominance. And we got to have your good friend Steve Kamen on the program a couple of months ago. And of course, I got to meet him in your class. So very thankful for that introduction. But of course, he, argued that although there are serious issues with the dollar and it is eroding, it still maintains kind of its value overall, and it maintains this global dominance. And you share a similar view in the book. Could you share, why you think that is and what is going to, hold the dollar up?
So, if we lived in a world of logic, Thomas, things would look very different. In a logical world, the fact that US macroeconomic policies are not working very well, especially the fact that the US has a very high level of public debt, with just the tradable portion of the federal debt now in excess of 100% of US GDP, and the gross debt is in fact even larger than that. That should make people very worried about holding US Treasury securities in particular. And then, while the US economy still remains, by many measures, the most dynamic, the largest in the world, has the deepest and most liquid financial markets, in my 2014 book that you referred to, Lourdes, I made the point that beyond all of this, it's the institutional framework in the US that really engenders the trust of both domestic and foreign investors in the dollar. So what are the elements of the institutional framework? The rule of law, where even the government is subservient to the laws that it creates, then a system of checks and balances, and also the independence of institutions like the Federal Reserve, which is tasked with maintaining the stable value of the dollar. All of these institutions are fraying before our eyes, so logically, the world should be turning away from the dollar. But at the same time, one of the elements that I emphasize in my book is that we are moving to a world where instability seems to have become the norm. So in an unstable world, investors, both foreign investors and domestic investors, both central banks and private investors, want a safe place to put their money. And unfortunately for the rest of the world, and perhaps fortunately for the US, the rest of the world has not really stepped up. If you look at the Eurozone, since the creation of the euro in 1999, it looked like the euro might be a credible rival to the dollar, but the US euro, remains riven by centrifugal forces that are continue to pull it apart, especially in terms of politics. And Europe remains a somewhat enervated economic force. China is, of course, a powerful economy, a major trading power, a manufacturing powerhouse, but it doesn't have the institutions that engender the trust of foreign investors. So while the dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves, for instance, has come down a little bit over the last few years, it doesn't look like there is any country that can seriously rival the dollar. And in fact, if you look at the dollar's role as a payment currency in international transactions, there are some indications that the dollar share is, if anything, has gone up, while those of other currencies like the euro have suffered. So I wrote a Financial Times op-ed recently where I made the point that essentially dollar dominance is everyone else's fault. If only the rest of the world would get its act together, we could move to a more logical world where, because of weak US macroeconomic policies, the dysfunction in the political system, and the erosion of the institutions, we should be seeing a migration away from the dollar. Now, central banks around the world talk about how desperately they want to diversify away from the dollar, how they want to escape from the clutches of the dollar-dominated financial system, but really they have nowhere else to go.
You are very right. If I look at my country of origin, Spain, during the almost 400 years empire, the Kingdom of Spain went bankrupt a number of times, but everybody continued to trust the currency. And in fact, when the dollar was launched, was pegged to the Spanish currency and used the same sign. Even today, the Mexican peso use a double dollar sign. So as you said, currencies and institutions are trust, are past and present. So, but if we look more, and as you said, and I fully agree, everybody benefits from this system. Everybody benefits that we have a currency that we trade, still we trade into that, although it seems that the SIP, the Chinese SWIFT, is increasing the value in the last months, and more is done through SIPs, to SIPs. So we have a moving world. And so looking at currencies again, going back to the currencies that are so important, and currency crisis produce such big crisis in emerging markets. So let's say the Asian crisis, the debt crisis in Latin America, the unpegging of the dollar, of the Argentine peso. One could argue that even now Argentina is suffering from it. The same with the real. The real currency, Brazilian real, has moved from 6 to the dollar to 2 to the dollar, back to 6. Definitely very difficult to plan anything with a currency that is so much volatile. Looking at the renminbi, again, it's very puzzling to me that an emerging market, probably not anymore an emerging market right now, but has been able, no other country that I know, no other emerging market that I know has been able to keep the renminbi one of the most stable currencies in the world in the last 20 plus years. So amazing, continues to do so. But okay, you just mentioned trust. What do you think more will take for the renminbi to rise as more prominent currency in the world?
The feature that you spoke about, stability of the renminbi, is of course relative to the US dollar.
Yeah.
That one can think about as a strength of the Chinese economy, that they've managed to keep the renminbi's value relative to the dollar in in a relatively narrow range. But at the same time, that is precisely the sort of thinking that is keeping the renminbi from gaining a lot more prominence in international finance. So if you think about China, it is at market exchange rates the second largest economy in the world. It's about two-thirds the size of the US economy. When one thinks about a currency's prominence in international finance as a reserve currency, that country needs to provide what are considered safe assets. Usually those are fixed income securities like government bonds, corporate bonds that foreign investors can invest in and that they can easily move into and out of. Now, one could argue that China and Chinese financial markets have many of these characteristics. So why doesn't the renminbi gain more traction? One is the issue I mentioned earlier about institutions. The Chinese central bank is not really independent. The rule of law seems to stop at the door of the Communist Party of China because it's very clear that the judicial system in China is quite effective at enforcing property and contractual rights, but it's never going to challenge the government if the government decides to change the rules of the game at the last minute. But the on-the-ground elements are very important as well. China still maintains some capital controls. And if one thinks about the period around 2014, 2015, when the Chinese had committed to opening up the capital account, but the renminbi was facing very significant depreciation pressures because there was a surge of capital outflows out of China because the currency was reflecting, concerns about the stock market, about the economy. China reimposed capital controls, mostly implicit rather than explicit ones, and the capital account has never been fully open. And one of the reasons the capital account is not fully open, that is, capital flows across the border are not completely free, is because China doesn't want to let its currency float relatively freely compared to the US dollar in particular. So the fact that the capital account is still quite closed, that the exchange rate is tightly managed, actually prevents China from doing what is necessary to allow the renminbi to play a major role in international finance. It would have to allow much freer flows of capital across its borders. It would have to allow much more renminbi liquidity to be available offshore. And all of those would be good for the renminbi to gain more traction in international finance, but would make it much harder to manage the currency's value. And for the Chinese government, it seems like stability of something like the currency's value, especially relative to the dollar, seems to be an important priority. And those are the sorts of factors that are holding the renminbi back. But you're right, Lourdes, the Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, what you refer to as CIPS, is going to play an important role in the renminbi playing a greater role in international finance. The CIPS also has the ability to conduct messaging of transactions without having to go through SWIFT. So it should, in principle, be much easier to trade Chinese renminbi for Indian rupees or Russian rubles or Brazilian reais. But the reality is that a lot of this trade is still taking place in dollars simply because it's very difficult to acquire or use renminbi offshore. But there is potential, and the big question now is whether China is willing to do what is necessary to allow the renminbi to play a more prominent role in global finance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's all tied together with this overarching idea of how, globalization has increased connections between countries. We need a good, medium of exchange and store value. The question is which currency that's going to end up being. Now, on the point of globalization, you argue in your book that it's done a bit in terms of, obviously, yes, increasing the productive capacity of economies, we get gains from trade, but also creating some inequality. Now, my question is, how does globalization really create larger inequality? I mean, clearly, cross-country inequality has fallen dramatically as a result. The real question is if it's within country inequality that's risen. And I think the literature is quite mixed on that. I looked at a meta-analysis and it basically found the Gini coefficient, yes, it's higher Gini coefficients, but if you look at, say, a different measure, like something like the Thiel index, it's pretty much zero or not as clear. So what's your theory? What's your idea as to why you think globalization should cause higher inequality?
So you're absolutely right, Thomas, that the benefits of globalization are measurable and quite substantial. In emerging market countries like China and India, millions, tens of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty, and the benefits are measurable even in a large economy like the United States. Um, you pointed out that there is a sense that it's not clear that globalization has created more inequality. And it's very difficult to isolate the effects of globalization because during the period when globalization really kicked off, starting in the mid 1980s and then gathering momentum in the 1990s and 2000s, there were many other factors at play, including rapid technological change, which of course continues to this day. And even setting aside these forces, in a market economy, some churn is natural. Some industries are going to do well, other industries won't. Some firms will prosper, others will shrivel away. But I think what has really been the problem is that there is a sense that some of these forces have created job losses, and this is where the element I speak about domestic politics becomes very important. This creates a disaffected class of people, and in countries like the United States, we don't have a good system to support people who have lost economic opportunities and whose skills may not be easily transferable without some retraining and so on to other firms, other industries, and so on. And what I think is really toxic is the sense that it's unfairness in terms of opportunity. So what many people see is that, countries like China seem to have prospered from globalization while they're being left out. And within their own countries, they see that the political and economic elites who seem to have gained a lot of benefits from globalization are in fact able to capture the political system. If you think about tax policies, regulatory policies in the United States, for instance, all of these seem to be favoring those who are already benefiting from these forces. So I think it's that element of unfairness that becomes really important. And when people feel disaffected, feel that the system is stacked against them, it gives some skilled politicians a very effective way of claiming that all the problems that many people in an economy face, including uncertain economic prospects, are the fault of the other. And the other could be defined in a broad way as domestic elites, both political and economic. It could be immigrants pouring over the border. It could be China. It could be the forces of globalization. So, this is where I think it's not the fault of globalization, but the fact that we did not have good mechanisms in place for distributing the benefits a little more evenly, and particularly of making sure that there wasn't this sense of unfairness that I think has led to globalization and other economic forces infecting domestic politics, which in turn, like I said earlier, affects geopolitics as well, and therefore the doom loop.
Yeah. No, I mean, certainly a big part of it is, I think, perception. What do people really view as the effects of globalization, regardless of what evidence might or theory might suggest? And I think that's so clear, obviously, in what we've seen in recent elections in the U.S. And across the world in general. I would say populism and anti-trade and anti-globalization has certainly been on the rise. And I think partially probably a failure of those of us who maybe are more favorable to free and open markets, a failure on our part to properly communicate those benefits. And as you mentioned, having proper support systems for those people that do genuinely lose out. And on kind of that similar subject, a big thing that a lot of people talk about are these unfair trade practices. And I wanted to bring up one of my favorite economists, Milton Friedman, who once said, if foreign governments want to use their taxpayers' money to sell people in the United States goods below cost, why should we complain? So I would have the same question for you. Why do you think this could be a problem outside of, say, the perception that it creates? And I think it clearly does create a very bad perception.
Yeah, here again, the distributional consequences are quite important. If you think about what China has accomplished, and when one talks about unfair trade practices, usually China's on the other side of this. And China has become a manufacturing powerhouse. through a variety of mechanisms. One is the ruthless efficiency that is the result of equally ruthless competition within China. But there is also the sense that China did not play by the rules of the game after its accession to the World Trade Organization, which gave it access to markets around the world, including the United States and other Western economies. And China did not provide equivalent access to foreign firms that wanted access to its markets, because China did have a rapidly expanding middle class, which of course continues to this day. But foreign firms feel that they have never gotten a level playing field. In addition, this protection has helped Chinese firms basically sell into the domestic market, compete, and become effective at cutting costs, increasing production efficiency, and so on, which then allows them to dominate global markets as well. There is also the sense that Chinese firms, not just in the state sector, but even in the private sector, do get some advantages from the state, relatively cheap financing from state-owned banks, relatively cheap land provided by provincial governments that want to encourage economic development, some tax breaks, cheap energy, and so on. So there is a sense that China gives its manufacturers a lot of advantages, especially in the early stages. Now, one could argue, as you just pointed out, Thomas, that if this means, cheap electric vehicles, cheap solar panels for the world, we are all better off, because this is going to help us address climate change, get much cheaper electric cars, and so on. But again, one needs to think about whether this has distributional consequences, where there is a sense that at the aggregate level, American consumers may be much better off because we have access to cheap consumer goods, automobiles, and so on, but where job prospects are lacking. And this is an issue we're going to have to deal with as many new technologies, including AI, create abundance. At some level, I am a techno-optimist. I think that if we think about the paucity of resources as being the root of conflict, resources are expanding so greatly that we should have less conflict, at least if you think about absolute living standards and so on. But I think the sense of unfairness, the fact that some people are getting most of the benefits, I think does have some very negative implications.
So staying in this theme of perception, trust, and institutions, the globalization has also worked based on very important institutions, and you had a key role in one of them at the IMF. Definitely, the credibility of these institutions is being questioned by both the West, by the US or Europe, and from emerging markets. So, what do you think should change in these institutions, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and of course, the World Bank?
So, the rules of the game, as embodied in these international institutions I referred to, Lourdes, was one of the forces that I thought would lead us towards more balance. But as I thought about it, I did see, as you have pointed out, that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are losing credibility from emerging market countries, which feel that these institutions remain stuck in a different world, where the voting power is still largely in the hands of the advanced economies, even though they have lost economic power. At the same time, the United States, because under its present political configuration, is taking a very narrow view about its own interests. It sees institutions like the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, and so on, as not really serving its needs. So it's disengaging from a lot of the institutions that it played a key role in setting up, including even the World Trade Organization. Now, one response from the emerging market economies has been to set up their own institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank set up by the BRICS economies, which are the four largest emerging market economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, one could argue again that competition among institutions is a potentially good thing, But I worry, as I write in the book, that this could lead to a fragmentation of the rules of the game, and the rules of the game lead to dissension rather than cohesion because different countries believe that they are operating under different rules. So in the book, I lay out what I think should be principles for thinking about a new architecture of global governance. And, I don't get too much into the specifics in this book, but the key issue is thinking about how one can ensure a system that is seen as fair and transparent, but that also evolves with changes in the underlying economic structures and so on. That is all a lot easier said than done, I will admit, but I do have some thoughts about that, which I will elucidate in some future writings. But that's, I think, something we really need to think hard about. And, one can, again, think about my book as, a very gloomy book about what brought us to this pass. I think, understanding what brought us here is really important, but one can also think about the book as a call to action. Many of these international institutions are losing legitimacy, crumbling before our eyes, but maybe there will be a chance to not just rejigger them at the margin, but to think about, a whole set of new institutions that could arise from the embers of what we're going through right now. So let's start thinking right now about what are the right principles that are necessary to undergird these institutions and make them really stable and durable.
Yeah, no, and I think it's important, to use these institutions that we're reaching out to what you call in the book middle powers. And I want to share a quote that you had in the book that I thought was really, I guess, provocative, which is from Robert M. Persig. And you say, when a shepherd goes to kill a wolf and takes his dog to see the sport, he should take care to avoid mistakes. The dog has a certain relationship to the wolf that the shepherd may have forgotten. So do you think we're facing a similar dilemma as the shepherd in this case? How would we be able to better train, those middle powers?
The middle powers, again, is a group of countries that I thought would create, force that would promote stability, because after all, stability matters the most to these countries. Now, the reality is that the world is stuck between two superpowers that have very different views about what the world should look like. Some would argue that Russia is a superpower as well, but it has, a lot of nukes, but is economically a shell. Europe has the ability to be a superpower, but has not really coalesced in a way that allows it to be a great power. So now we are stuck between the US, which is seen as an untrustworthy and unreliable ally. China would like to promote itself as the defender of free trade, globalization, the rules-based system, but doesn't have very well-trusted institutions. So everybody else is sort of in the middle. So at the Davos World Economic Forum conference in January, Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, laid out, actually, that was where I did the soft launch of my book, because my book came out only a couple of weeks after Davos. But Carney, of course, took the words out of my mouth and put them in much more eloquent terms, that we are moving to a world, like I said, which is unstable, and middle powers, need to just find ways to move forward. They're not going to agree on everything, because this group includes rich, small, poor countries, small, large countries. And his view was, let's just be practical. Let's agree on things that a small group of us may agree on, and then create alliances, and that's the best we can do. That's a very pragmatic approach and might be the best option that is out there. But I worry that what I refer to in the book as is issue-based alliances are not going to be based on any fundamental shared values, and they're not really going to engender trust. So they're going to be transactional, and I'm not sure that's going to help stability. I talk about India, the archetypal middle power in my book. It's a large economy, has the power to act as a stabilizing force. But although I'm oversimplifying a bit here, if you think about what India did when Russia invaded Ukraine, it, essentially sided with Russia and China, did not participate in US and other Western sanctions because access to cheap oil was very important. But India sees its fundamental values and interests as more closely aligned with the democratic economies of the West. So rather than being a stabilizing force, India teeters from one side to another, depending on the issue at hand. It might be the only realistic path forward, but I don't think it's going to mean more stability either for these middle powers themselves or for the system that they are stuck in.
So just for closing, two comments. One is that in the report that we publish every year with Anne Miru at the Canizares Center for Emerging Markets, we had the 10th edition and we looked back of what has happened in the emerging markets in the last 25 years, and more particular in the last 10 years. So maybe this doom and loop is more something of the West, because if you look at the data for emerging markets, there is growth in economic terms, GDP, GDP per capita, also social variables, poverty reduction, life expectancy, child mortality, any of these are positive. So the last 25 years, excellent for emerging markets. And as emerging markets have most of the population, one could say that the world is in a better place. And then all of a sudden we say, oh my God, what is the part of this pie? The pie has become larger. What happens? So two questions. One, we are in an academic institution. We have to give always hope for the next generation, for Thomas and classmates. Let's give them hope on the one hand. And then in relation with that, we always end up these webinars asking you, please mention an emerging market and why. Choose one that you think, okay, the next years will be very, very positive.
Okay, so first of all, I should mention that I view my book really as a call to action. Now, in the cheerful version of the book I planned to write, I was planning to make the argument that institutions are really important. I refer to a few of them: the checks and balances, the rule of law, a free and fearless press that holds public officials to account, independence of institutions like the central bank, and a global governance system that I think all countries can see as legitimate and that evolves with changing times. I think it's going to take a lot of engagement from all of us as citizens, not just of our countries, but of our communities and of the world as a unit, recognizing that only common prosperity is a sensible way forward. It's going to take business leaders, community leaders, and of course national leaders who can pull us along by talking about our hopes rather than pandering to our fears. The present political moment makes it hard to see all of this work, but there are some encouraging signs. The elections in Hungary, despite the fraying of institutions in that country, did show that the corrective mechanisms do still seem to be at play. So I hope that these corrective mechanisms can work, but again, I think my book should be a clarion call to those of us who think that the process will take care of itself. We need to work very hard to protect our institutions, to prevent them from eroding any further. And Lourdes, one way of interpreting one of your questions might be the emerging markets are doing great. Even the advanced economies, especially the US, seems to be doing great. Every day the stock market seems to hit new highs. The economy seems to be doing decently. So where is the doom loop? And my answer to that is that, you can have things look very calm and actually pretty good on the surface while deep tensions are building up underneath. In the 2000s, the period of the great moderation, when it looked like the world economy was doing great, inflation was under control, emerging markets were growing fast, advanced economies were growing well, huge financial system stresses were building up underneath the surface. Now I worry that there is a deeper set of stresses, especially related to the social fabric in democracies, that is really at risk. So, yes, there is a lot, thanks to AI and other technological developments, that is very positive in terms of expanding the pie. But I think it's a moment also for us not to get carried away by what is happening on the surface. We need to think very hard about what is happening at the bottom. And as for an emerging market that is doing well, has great potential, I cannot, of course, go anywhere other than India. I think the country has enormous potential still. We've seen it do very well. The Modi government, building upon what some previous governments have done, have steered the country in a very positive direction. There are enormous problems still, and I think there is a concern that any notion of triumphalism at this stage may actually be self-defeating. So it's a potentially good moment for India, but there still needs to be a lot done in terms of policy reforms just to allow the intrinsic dynamism of India to shine forth.
Yeah, certainly our hopes for India and, of course, all of those middle powers that you mentioned, all emerging market economies and the world in general. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, Eswar. We'll be sure to include a link to the new book, which is a fantastic read. I'd really recommend it for anyone interested. And for the Canisades Center, along with Beating Sisyphus, we really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here today.